Welcome back to the treacherous golden age of piracy. Last time on Journey Through Time, we met Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two remarkable women who dressed as men and fought as pirates under the infamous Calico Jack Rackham in the Caribbean. Their story is one of defiance and unconventional choices carved out in a chaotic world. But piracy was never a long-term game. Though Nassau was a pirate haven, by 1720 the British were cracking down. Join us as their luck begins to run out, leading to a midnight ambush, a desperate last stand, and a trial that will seal their fate. This episode of Journey Through Time is brought to you by family history website Find My Past.
Today's episode draws on one of the most revealing records in British history, the 1921 census, accessed through Find My Past's archive, the perfect starting point to explore your family tree.
Find My Past doesn't just record names. It captures people's lives. It captures their homes, their work, the fabric of their daily life in the ways that we've been talking about.
You can see entire households frozen in time, a name, an occupation, even how many rooms there were in their house.
And David, you and I have both used Find My Past for years in our own work. It's where family history is understood. It's where we find the records that reveal the decisions, the struggles, the lives that we're looking into.
Yeah, if you've ever wondered what shaped those who came before you, how they lived, what they did, what they went through, who they stood beside.
You can start uncovering those stories today in collections from censuses, military rolls, and parish registers.
It's just waiting to be discovered.
Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime to take a free trial and get 30% off their most popular subscriptions and start understanding your family history. Free trial auto-renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And this week, we are telling the story of what happened to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the two women pirates from the golden age of piracy in the early decades of the 18th century. Now, last week, we ended with Mary, who is the good girl of our story. Good is a relative term here. We are talking about active pirates. She is a cross-dressing former soldier and who has now joined the same pirate crew as our bad girl, Anne Bonny, the wayward lover of the infamous pirate Captain Jack Rackham, Calico Jack Rackham. So now we have the two of them, now both revealed to be women, though cross-dressing women, in the Caribbean Sea, setting off on a pirate expedition to rob, raid, and to terrorize.
That was beautifully done, David. We will now pick up the story exactly there. So, as listeners might remember, in the last episode, good girl Mary Read, as you say, a relative term, she was living as a soldier in the army, and she fell in love with a comrade in arms. Now, we pick up the story. That man has died, she's become a pirate, and according to our source, which is Captain Johnson's unreliable 1724 History of Pirates, Mary Read is now on the pirate ship and she falls in love with a comrade again. She has a habit of doing this. As listeners will remember, there was some question about the sexual relationship among Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and Calico Jack. Whatever happened amongst them, Mary Read at some point takes up with another crew member. Now, he's not given a name, unfortunately, for storytelling purposes, but Johnson tells us that good girl Mary Read falls madly in love with this pirate sailor.
Who's another member of the crew.
Who's another member of Calico Jack's crew. This is because Johnson always has Mary Read be monogamous. He doesn't like her to be sleeping around. Anne Bonny is the bad girl. She sleeps around. He likes Mary Read to be, quote, virtuous. And so she always just wants to settle down in Johnson's account. She's always trying to find the right guy. Her unfortunate taste for piracy notwithstanding, she keeps looking for Mr. Right. And so she falls in love, he says, with this pirate, and she decides that she's going to seduce him. He says she decides to do this by, and I quote, carelessly showing him her breasts.
That's a seduction method, according to Johnson's history.
Whoops, I showed you my breasts carelessly. Whoops-a-daisy. Now, we might think that if she's the good girl, the chaste one in the pair, she shouldn't really be flashing her breasts at men to get them to sleep with her, but that's what he says that she did. So she basically exposes herself to him literally and metaphorically as a woman. And he thinks, great, because he is on a pirate ship after all. So, and Anne Bonny's busy with Calico Jack. So they begin an affair, Johnson says. And at this point, then, her lover, the unnamed other pirate, he quarrels with yet another pirate. So he gets into some kind of a fight, and the other pirate challenges Mary Read's new lover to a duel. Mary is enamored of her pirate lover, but not certain of his skills in the duel. So Johnson tells us that she's worried that he's going to lose and her lover is going to die. And so she takes matters into her own hands. And before the duel can take place, Johnson says, she picks a fight with the opponent herself. And she basically steps into the breach to stop her lover from being, endangered. And Johnson tells us she fought him, the opponent, she fought him at sword and pistol and killed him on the spot.
And Mary Read is a former soldier, so this is in some ways very believable.
This is one of the more believable parts of the romance that he spins around these two characters. It certainly suggests you shouldn't mess with Mary Read. And as you say, she would have the skills to back it up. It's a swashbuckling fantasy either way, but it could be possible. And as we said last time, which is important to remember, although Johnson's history is unreliable, he had access to other sources that may well be lost. So we don't know which parts of the story could be true. And he may have other sources for this tale. Anyway, so Mary Read, we are told, fights in a duel. So she's flashing her breasts at a lover. She gets this lover. She fights a duel. She saves his life. And meanwhile, Anne Bonny and Calico Jack are still having their, fun. And so there they are, basically, having a splendid time, sailing around the Caribbean, carousing, killing each other, killing rivals, bed swapping, who knows?
They haven't done any actual piracy.
You noticed that, did you?
So the business model of piracy isn't based on how many affairs you have and how many duels you fight. You kind of need to actually do a bit of pirating.
We need some actual piracy. Now, it's important to say that they were engaging in piracy almost certainly in the months leading up to the story that we're about to tell. We just don't have a record of it. But now it all comes to a head in the summer of 1720. And now we know in a pretty detailed way, actually, what happened.
And we know because there are sources. There are now historical documents. We go from unreliable sources like Captain Johnson's History of the Pirates to official records, because these are, to slightly give away the end, these are legal documents. These
are indeed trial records, which listeners from the first episode will remember we opened with the trials of Captain John Rackham.
So what do those documents tell us?
So they tell us that on August 22nd, 1720, Rackham's crew, which definitely included Mary Read and Anne Bonny at this point on this day, they were at Nassau Harbor in the Bahamas, and they saw an unmanned sloop anchored peacefully in the harbor, and they rowed out to it. They find this boat sitting out in the harbor. They row out to it. They climb aboard. They raise anchor, and they sail off with it. So they're off and running on their Bonnie and Clyde adventures now. They're on the road, and, well, we'll see what happens. So the governor at this point, and listeners from last time will remember that he wanted to flog Anne Bonny for running off with Calico Jack Rackham. He immediately issues a proclamation. He says they are hereby proclaimed pirates and enemies to the crown of Great Britain. And the announcement, the proclamation, includes two women by name identified as Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So this is one of the corroborations in the historical record where we know people saw them. They knew it was Anne Bonny and Mary Read getting on the boat and taking off. And the governor says, these guys are pirates. They're outlaws. So now there is effectively a bounty on their head and everybody needs to give chase. I said a second ago, Bonnie and Clyde, it's Thelma and Louise. It's outlaws heading off with the forces of law and order not far behind. So the governor dispatches two sloops to hunt them down.
And these sloops are privateers, so they're not Royal Navy ships, but they are pirates who are officially sanctioned pirates to hunt down Mary and Anne and Jack Rackham, who are freelance pirates.
They're bounty hunters, right? So they've got these bounty hunters. The governor says there will be a reward for the capture of these pirates, and he specifies that Anne Bonny and Mary Read are among the pirate crew.
They have a price on their head.
Indeed, and that is an incentive, and people go after them. So on September 1st, 1720, we know this again from the trial record, Rackham's crew, including Anne Bonny and Mary Read, swore a pirate pact. They agreed that they would, and I'm quoting, rob, plunder, and take all such persons which they should meet on the high sea. And the court will describe this as their evil designs, which I think is sort of mustache twirling villainy. I kind of like that.
And this idea of a pirate pact, that they all agree that they're in this together, the hell with the rest of the world, it's one for all and all for one. That's not unusual, and that's not something that we should have any doubt about. Pirates did have these agreements with one another, almost like a contract with each other.
Yeah, it's a covenant, right? And we were talking last time about the ways in which they kind of set up alternative social orders, these countercultures, these slightly more democratic systems sometimes, the more meritocratic systems, which were flexible enough to let women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read into them on occasion. And the way that you set something like that up is you set your own rules. And so that's what they would do, is they would have their pact and they would say, these are the rules that we're going to abide by. And it's the code, right? The pirate code. And so you would agree that you're going to look out for each other and you're going to act as pirates. And that means you've undertaken that you won't let a ship pass peacefully by, that you have an obligation to attack the ships that you encounter. That's what you've signed up for.
And you're all going to do it together. You're all going to be complicit in it, but you're also all going to share the spoils.
Everybody gets to share. So share and share alike, all for one and one for all. As you said, Musketeers are a different story, but maybe we'll get to them another time. You know, it's one thing to say that Mary Read and Anne Bonny were both on the ships, that witnesses saw them and the governor names them as part of the pirate crew. But we should note here, as we start to talk about the actual pirate adventures that they engage in, that witnesses later testified that both women were fully armed and that they were not just active members of the pirate crew. They were aggressive. They were eager for violence. One of the witnesses said that Anne Bonny had a gun in her hand. So we have to picture them as we tell this story, very actively participating in the piratical adventures.
And this is a fully fledged pirate expedition with everything that you'd expect. They are armed. This is a ship that they have stolen. They're going hunting for other ships to attack, and they raise, I presume, the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger.
They do. Now, this is a fun part of the story because the Jolly Roger is another, such an iconic, legendary aspect of pirate stories. And it's another one where we might think that it's only from legend and that it doesn't have any historical basis.
That's one of the things about the story of pirates, is that the bits that you imagine might have been made up by Robert Louis Stevenson or by Hollywood producers in the 1950s, very often those bits are true. Now, the Jolly Roger just completely, to me, sounds like it was made up by the Victorians or by Hollywood, but it absolutely existed.
And our source for the name Jolly Roger for the black pirate ship is our old friend, Captain Johnson, and his history of the pirates. He is the one who actually gives it a name in the historical records. Now, the actual origins of the black pirate flag are obscure, but we know it was in use by the early 1700s. There are lots of contemporary accounts that make clear that pirates were flying the Jolly Roger. But Johnson doesn't write of our familiar image. Everybody knows, of course, the black pirate flag that has a skull with crossbones. But Johnson talks about different designs. So he says that one had a white skeleton in the middle of it, so a full skeleton. And the skeleton is holding a dart in one hand, and the dart is stabbing a bleeding heart. And in the other hand, he's holding an hourglass. It's not a flag I would want to see if I was sailing around in the Caribbean.
Sounds like a cool tattoo to me, rather than a flag.
Right? So much cooler than a Jolly Roger. Exactly. If anybody's thinking about a pirate tattoo, here's a historically accurate, much more interesting than the cliche of the Jolly Roger. Go for this one and tell them Journey Through Time sent you. Johnson describes another pirate flag that he says has the figure of death in red.
So the skull and crossbones is a pirate flag, but it's not the only one.
Yeah. And I don't know what the figure of death in this particular one looks like, because there are different ways you could, figure death. And he doesn't tell us any more than that. Is it the Grim Reaper? Is it, is he holding a sickle? I don't know. There's a third that features a little bit more like the previous one. It's death holding an hourglass with one hand, holding crossed bones. And then he has a heart dripping 3 drops of blood beneath it.
And this is on a flag design that you would see on a ship coming towards you across the Caribbean Sea.
So what they would do is they would literally lower their colors that make them look like an innocent ship. And as they're preparing for attack, they would fly the Jolly Roger. as, the indication that they're coming for you. So it's a threat. And the whole idea of it is to intimidate. The idea is actually to try to get people so scared that they'll give up without a fight.
And that's a big part of the strategy of piracy, the way in which pirates would give themselves nicknames like Calico Jack, like Blackbeard, the Jolly Roger. It's about making it absolutely clear to people on merchant ships that we are dangerous, we are serious, and do you really want to fight us?
It's a terror campaign, right? It's a campaign of intimidation. We were talking last time about how there are analogies with the mafia, and it's the same thing. Those nicknames, that they're there to frighten you. They're there so you don't put up a fight. You see the Jolly Roger, just give up now, and then they can just take your ship and not have to worry about the fight.
And the key thing is it's not your ship. It's a ship that you're a sailor on that belongs to some merchant in Bristol or London, as does the cargo that the pirates are going to steal. Do you really want to fight these guys with these cutlasses and the Jolly Roger to defend something that you don't own when we know that sailors were paid a pittance? Intimidation was a great way of saying, this ain't really worth it for you.
And the truth is that it worked a lot of the time, that ships would surrender without a fight.
And that same factor of creating all of this drama in order to intimidate people, that's part of the reason, of course, why the legends develop, because it is dramatic, because it's meant to be dramatic, because you're trying to convince people not to fight you by terrifying them. So you have to be dramatic. You have to have all of this imagery. And then that imagery just feeds into books and feeds into accounts, and accounts like Johnson, and then novels like Treasure Island. So pirates were kind of perfect to become the kind of legends that they are today, because they just needed to be dramatic.
And they're burnishing their own legends for exactly that reason. So they create the legend because they want the legend to precede them. And then it does, as you say, and then it goes all the way into fiction. And then 200 years later, here we are, with these familiar stories. But they do have a basis in fact, as we're saying. So speaking of pirate myths, and all of our fantasies, we all know what the pirates should be going off in search of, right? They're in search of buried treasure. They're in search of pieces of eight, gold doubloons, jeweled goblets, treasure chests, spilling out with jewels. Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, on their sloop that they have pinched from Nassau Harbor and they're sailing around Jamaica with, their first attack is slightly less the stuff of romance and legend. So on September 3rd, 1720, just days after forming their plan,
and making their pact together.
They make their pirate pact, and they say they're going to assault any ship that they encounter. They're going to take it by force and take any plunder they can get from it. They are sailing northwest, back toward the Bahamas, in fact, and they spot 7 small fishing boats. And they surround them and board them.
Fishing boats. Now, they have said they're going to attack every ship they see, but this is kind of scraping the bow.
So they're brandishing their weapons against these hapless fishermen. And Rackham's crew plunders their catch and steals their fishing gear.
Oh, God, this is a bit rubbish.
It's so anticlimactic, isn't it? I love it.
What's this worth? How much do they get away with? How much is the fish that they steal valued at?
Yeah, so the total value of their stolen fish, it is like, anybody who knows the film A Fish Called Wanda is just kind of all I'm picturing. Anyway, it was about 10 pounds, which isn't quite as pathetic as it sounds today. At the time, that was about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds.
But 2,000 pounds worth of fish and fishing gear.
Right? So
a long way from pieces of eight and gold doubloons.
I think even today, this would be, petty theft, I'm afraid, right? As we say, it's fish, it's tackle, it's maybe some barrels of rum, it's some coils of rope.
Yeah, it's hardly piracy on the high seas.
It's really not what you picture. It's not your buried treasure or sunken gold, right? It's just the bare necessities of whatever those ships had at hand.
And was this a violent attack on these fishing boats?
Well, they threatened them, but they left the fishermen unharmed. We said last time that Captain Calico Jack Rackham was known actually for his mercy. He was not a bloodthirsty pirate, and he tended to leave his victims unharmed. So they were afraid, but he just stole their fish and their tackle and whatever else they had to hand, and left them in peace to make their way back to civilization. Now, that was September 3rd, 1720. They sail around for a few more weeks, and it seems as if they didn't encounter anybody, or if they did, they failed to board them. It's not clear. We know there's a gap of about a month. And then on October 1st, 1720, they do a little bit better. You'll be glad to hear. This time, they are heading south back toward Jamaica. So they've just been sailing around, basically, looking for prey. And they encounter 2 merchant sloops. They're about 10 miles off the coast of Haiti. And Calico Jack orders the crew to open fire. There's a brief chase. They board the ships. Again, we have the captains and their men threatened at gunpoint. The vessels are ransacked. This time, they do a little bit better. So this time, Calico Jack and his crew steal valuable trade cargo from these merchant vessels. And they're worth about £1,000 at the time, which is roughly 150 to 200,000 pounds today.
Oh, so a lot better.
So considerably more serious theft, right? This is no longer fish and rope. These are merchant ships. So they are engaged in trade and they have valuable cargo. So we're talking textiles, tobacco, rum, maybe even coin. It's a more serious haul. It's rather more worth risking your life for, than codfish.
It shows the difference between the myth and the reality, because that idea that this is about capturing Spanish treasure ships, that these are going to be ships full of chests, full of jewels and coins, that's a sort of 16th century idea. This is the early 18th century. It's an age of trade. It's an age in which the products on good are the products of the plantations, the products of the East India Company. It's about stuff that you can sell between the islands. It's about commodities like sugar and rum and tobacco that's valuable, but it's not treasure. So that idea of treasure and hidden treasure and chests full of jewels, that's the bit which isn't really true about the pirate myth.
As you say, it's a 16th century reality and a 19th century legend. By the 19th century, you're talking about a time where currency is much more regulated across the world, right? So this is, as you say, an age of barter. This is where it's just about the goods that you have to hand. But from their point of view, we're laughing at them, ridiculing their pathetic little haul. But from their point of view, this is a way to make a living. This is 6 figures worth of goods today that they stole. Anybody would consider that a serious theft.
I mean, they're doing financially far better now. Now they've given up attacking fishing ships, but it is very different from the myth of attacking treasure ships and having chests full of jewels. It's still theft. It's still violent theft. They've fired their guns at these ships. The people's lives have been at risk. People have been obviously terrified because they've been threatened. So it's piracy, but not kind of as we imagine it, perhaps.
As you say, the reality is much more mundane. And this is the point where the historical reality of piracy converges most widely from our fantasies, from the Hollywood version of it. I don't know of any Hollywood one where they're just stealing fish, but that was actually what happened.
So the Jolly Roger is absolutely true, but the idea of X marks the spot, that's Robert Louis Stevenson and people making stuff up many years later.
Many years later, precisely that. So they've done a little bit better now. They've got some, valuable cargoes that they've added to their fish, and they are following the north coast of Jamaica. And on October 19th, 1720, so about 2-3 weeks later, they come across a schooner. They fire on the schooner. They force it to stop. They board. This time, they take the master and the crew captive for a couple of days while they help themselves to their cargo. And part of that cargo, the record shows, was 50 rolls of tobacco. So here we get some of that.
Trade goods probably from Virginia or Maryland, somewhere like that.
So they've got their tobacco and probably produced on a slave plantation. And they have 9 bags of pimento. We're talking about trades in spice and in food. And all of that is also valuable at the time.
Valuable stuff, but still not treasure.
It's pimentos.
Yeah.
I mean, I like a pimento, but it's, again, not the stuff of pirate romance.
And how much was this haul worth?
Again, we're back to smaller numbers. This stolen cargo was worth about £20 at the time, which is about £3,000 to £4,000 today. So back to relatively small potatoes. Maybe literally, we don't know. So once they had their cargo, then again, remembering that Calico Jack is a merciful pirate, he releases the schooner and he sends them back on their way, and they keep sailing.
This is storing up trouble for the future, though, isn't it? I mean, this is the 3rd raid, and a lot of people have seen Calico Jack, his crew, Mary and Anne, engaged in piracy and lived to tell the tale.
He has left a lot of witnesses, a trail of witnesses, one might even say. And one of the witnesses in this particular attack on October 19th, is one of the ones who specifically said that Anne Bonny was engaged in the battle. So he said that Anne Bonny gave gunpowder to the men during the battle, and that when the women saw, because remember, they sailed with them for 2 days. So he said that when the women saw any vessel, gave chase, or attacked, they wore men's clothes. And at other times, they wore women's clothes.
So that detail about this cross-dressing, moving between men's clothes and women's clothes, that comes from evidence that's given by someone who actually sees them engaged in piracy.
This is an eyewitness.
Yeah.
So this is much more important, reliable, and to my mind, more interesting than Johnson's version, which has them just in the Shakespearean manner, comedy of errors, as we were saying, always dressing as boys and just passing as men. This is much more interesting, to me anyway, that they are basically, when they're pirating, they wear men's clothes, and when they're off duty, they wear women's clothes. And everybody knows what they're doing. Everybody knows they're women.
Why that need to switch? I don't get that.
I mean, we can only speculate, right? There's no certainty here. It may be there were ways in which women's clothing could be more comfortable at the time for women in various ways. In terms of some practical functions and practical necessities, skirts are more modest. I mean, there's certain bodily functions that women have to, everybody has to deal with, but that women might have preferred to have skirts to cover up. They might have just been more comfortable in them generally. Obviously, the men's clothes are more practical for battle than women's clothes are. But if it isn't true that they spent all of their lives in men's clothes, then they might just find them more comfortable. It might be that they felt more attractive in them. I mean, remember that Anne Bonny and Calico Jack are lovers. Maybe Calico Jack likes her in a dress. Who can say, right? You can think of multiple reasons why they might do it. But I personally think it's considerably more interesting than the idea that they were just passing themselves off as men.
I mean, far be it from me to tell Calico Jack Rackham how to pirate, but
have you got some suggestions? You're going to mansplain how
they're not making that much money, and they're leaving a lot of witnesses behind them. I mean, it does feel like things are going to catch up with them. Where do they go next?
Things are going to catch up with them quickly, but they have a few more good days of plunder ahead of them. So the very next day, in fact, on October 20th, they attack another merchant sloop. This one is anchored. They fire their cannons at it. The merchant crew just abandons the ship. They fled to shore. And so again, we have witnesses to tell the tale, and the pirates loot the ship. They take cargo and supplies valued at approximately 300 pounds, which is about 50 to 60,000 pounds today. So again, a much better haul. And they take the sloop. So they've got a growing fleet now. They've been taking these boats and they are sailing with these different sloops. And here in this battle, we have another witness testifying that Anne Bonny is actively involved. He says that Anne Bonny held a gun in her hand during the battle, and that both Bonny and Reed were, and I quote from the record, very profligate, cursing and swearing much, and very ready and willing to do anything to those on board.
Another witness, another testimony, another fingering of them and saying you are engaged. These women were actively engaged in piracy.
Fully participating in the violence and the criminality. Exactly. Now, we don't have the exact date, but it's a few days later, late October 1720. They are sailing west along Jamaica's north coast, and Captain Calico Jack Rackham and his crew encounter, and we were saying a minute ago that reality can sometimes be disappointing. They encounter a canoe with a woman in it named Dorothy Thomas and some provisions, and they steal everything of value from this woman in a canoe.
They attack a canoe.
They attack a canoe. And there's a woman, and she's just paddling offshore. She's presumably, going to visit relatives or whatever, who knows. And she just has her provisions. It's just what she brought with. She's not even trading anything. It's just what she brought with her for her journey. It's all so small beer that they don't even register the worth of the stolen goods. It doesn't even make the record, right? It is like stealing somebody's lunch money, and the police don't even bother to put it on the charge sheet.
I mean, I know technically it's piracy, but it's the sort of thing you'd get a police caution for today.
100%, right? I mean, they are like I was saying before, they're stealing codfish. They're stealing mackerel from a canoe. This is not the romance of piracy that we were hoping for. But Dorothy Thomas is an interesting witness. Again, Calico Jack is leaving his witnesses alive. Anne Bonny and Mary Reed, though, are starting to get worried about exactly the point that you have been making, David, is they're recognizing that this is maybe risky behavior to leave so many witnesses. Dorothy Thomas testifies that Anne Bonny and Mary Read wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and that each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands and cursed and swore at the men to murder the deponent, i.e. the woman testifying, Dorothy Thomas, and that they should kill her to prevent her coming against them.
So they can see the danger. They can see that they actually, if they're going to do this, they need to be far, far more ruthless than Calico Jack wants to be.
They are shouting at Calico Jack and the other pirates to murder Dorothy Thomas because otherwise she's going to testify against them. And Dorothy Thomas testifies that this is what they said. So it's Anne Bonny and Mary Read who are saying, as you say, are you crazy? We keep leaving these witnesses, and as the saying has it, dead men tell no tales. So that's what they want to have happen. So in other words, they're the more dangerous ones in the crew, according to Dorothy Thomas.
And the fact that we can say, according to Dorothy Thomas, is because Jack Rackham didn't listen to them.
I did not listen to them. He leaves Dorothy Thomas alive, as he did all of them. Now, Dorothy Thomas also makes clear, because as we've just said, she describes them wearing men's clothes and they've got handkerchiefs tied around their head. She says that she could tell they were women, though, and she's sure that they were the notorious women pirates because she could see, and this is again from the trial record, the largeness of their breasts. So the legendary figures of the Amazon, the warrior women, they were known for fighting bare-breasted. It seems unlikely that in 1720, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who, after all, Dorothy Thomas has just told us, were wearing men's jackets. It seems unlikely that they were wearing men's jackets, but unbuttoned the shirts to expose their breasts during battle. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's exactly what they were doing. But this is, in fact, the only mention of their breasts in the historical record. And the reason I mention this is because Johnson has been telling us all of these stories about these women flashing their breasts at each other. But Dorothy Thomas doesn't say the breasts are naked. She just says she can see they're women because they have breasts. That's literally all that she's saying. It's an ordinary observation. These are females. I can see their breasts. But it seems to have triggered all of these fantasies. So then Johnson starts telling these stories where they're flashing their breasts. He's like, "Ooh, breasts are in the story."
Breasts have been mentioned. It is open season. This is the 18th century. He's a writer. I think
he's a man.
He's a man. It's good enough for me.
It's good enough for a lot of men as soon as breasts are mentioned that there will be all kinds of stories about the breasts. Exactly. So to get away from the question of their breasts, much as some listeners may not want us to, we're back to Dorothy Thomas in her canoe. They have stolen her provisions. They have once again let her live to tell the tale. And they have left us, I think we can agree, at a low point, having stolen a poor woman's fish out of her canoe. And their fortunes are not about to improve.
So join us after this break and we'll discover what happens in the end to Anne and Mary. Welcome back. We find ourselves now on the night of October 27th, 1720. What happens to Anne and Mary on that fateful night?
The pirate crew of Calico Jack is on their stolen sloop. They are anchored near Negril Point, Jamaica.
So on the far west of Jamaica.
And a British privateer spots them firing a gun.
So this is not a Royal Navy ship, but it is a ship that has permission, has authority to pursue pirates.
And when it sees a kind of rogue gun going off, it makes them suspicious. So they think that shouldn't be happening. Let's just go and inspect things. So this ship gives chase, and it's a bigger ship, better outfitted, and it closes in by about 10 o'clock that night.
So in pitch blackness.
Total darkness in open water. And as was the custom, it hails the vessel and asks them to identify themselves. A voice from the dark replies, "John Rackham from Cuba." Now, the privateer knows that that's the name of the notorious Calico Jack.
And the governor of the Bahamas has put a price on their head. Everyone knows this is the pirate that they're pursuing.
So a proclamation has been ordered. It's basically a wanted poster. So they know who it is that they're looking for. And John Rackham identifies himself. And so the privateer says, "Strike your colors and surrender to the King of England." In other words, lower your flag, strike your colors.
It's all over. You've been caught.
You will be taken.
Powerful ship.
Put your guns down and we will take you peacefully if you surrender. Someone on Rackham's sloop, and as you just said, it's the dead of night, it's dark, too dark to identify the speaker. But someone on Rackham's sloop shouts back, "We'll strike no strikes," meaning no surrender, game on. Now, most of the sources here assume that it was Rackham shouting this defiant, "We'll strike no strikes." But as we've been discussing, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were actually the more belligerent ones, according to the eyewitness testimony of many of the people involved in these encounters.
They seem more ruthless.
I like to think it was one of them shouting, "We'll strike no strikes," but we don't know. Regardless of who shouts it, they do not surrender. They fire a swivel gun, so a small rotating cannon that you can use at close range. So they swivel their gun around and they fire at the ship. The privateer on this much bigger ship immediately orders return fire, and they have a broadside. They unleash a volley of musket fire, cannon, and it shatters the sloop's boom, leaves the sloop heavily damaged, unable to move. So this glorious, defiant last stand endured for all of about a minute. But more of our kind of anticlimactic, unromantic story here. So as soon as the privateer's cannons struck, we are told, Rackham and most of his male crew panicked.
With some good reason.
It's scary, but they hid in the hold of the ship, refusing to fight. At least one source says that they'd been drinking, which wouldn't have helped. And, we haven't discussed this, but the historical record actually shows that pirates were frequently incapacitated by drink. There's actually one story about a pirate who got captured and was so drunk he had to be hoisted out of the ship. So it wouldn't be that surprising if they were drunk.
This is a world awash with rum.
And, as we've been saying, it's not a very pleasant lifestyle in all kinds of ways. So, would probably want to be drunk for a lot of it. So they may well have been incapacitated by drink. They are hiding in the hold of the ship. And according to the sources, only Anne Bonny and Mary Read and one other pirate unnamed remained on deck and held out with the fight.
They want to fight it out, even though their ship's been crippled by this broadside.
They are furious at their crewmates' cowardice, and they're trying to rally a last stand. They're cursing, they're swearing at their shipmates, and Mary Read is shouting at them to come up and fight like men. So, of course, the one yelling "fight like men" was a woman, naturally. They don't come out of the hold. No one emerges. It doesn't work. And Mary Read is so enraged that she fires her pistols into the hold, kills one of her crew members, and wounds others. This is one of the moments, again, we were talking about how arbitrary it is that Captain Johnson decides in his history of pirates that Mary Read is the good girl. She's the one firing into the hold. She murders her own crewmates, and he decides that she's the good girl when she's as tough as nails. I love Mary Read. Anyway, unfortunately, their last stand didn't last long either, and they are soon, of course, overwhelmed and outnumbered because it's these two women and one other pirate trying to hold off this large ship. So they fail. They get very quickly captured shortly after 10 p.m. So this whole thing happens in a matter of minutes.
It's been really quick.
It's very quick. It's all over very quickly. The privateer's men board the sloop. They take full control. They capture everyone. And by next morning, all of them are in custody and they're taken to Spanish Town, which is the capital of Jamaica, to stand trial. They face the death penalty.
Inevitably, that is the sentence for piracy.
It's a serious crime, right? We've been joking about them stealing fish, but it is a serious crime. And as we've been saying, the British Empire is cracking down on it. They want to make an example. They want a deterrent. So they're going to have these big trials and they're going to make clear that they're taking piracy very serious indeed. So yes, they face the death penalty. Now, Johnson reports that Mary Read actually had something to say about facing the death penalty. He says that she declared that if she were hanged as a pirate, it would be no great hardship because if it weren't for the threat of death, she says, every cowardly fellow would turn pirate and so infest the seas that men of courage must starve.
So the hallmark of being a pirate is to not fear the noose.
Because if it were easy, anybody would do it. Then any dude is just going to come out and claim to be a pirate. So exactly, she says it's an acid test for piracy. She says every true pirate preferred the death penalty because without it, the ocean would be crowded with rogues like the land, and no merchant would venture out so that the trade in a little time would not be worth following.
It's a kind of crazy position to take, which is that unless pirates are willing to be hanged, then the business model of both piracy and global trade would collapse.
It doesn't work because nobody will be willing to come out and trade. So you actually have to have the death penalty. I mean, the swagger here is impressive.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that's a quite extreme position for someone to take who isn't in a prison cell awaiting the death penalty.
For exactly this reason, the trials were very swift. And as we've been saying, the outcome was not ever really in doubt. Rackham and all the male members of his crew were rapidly tried on 16 November 1720. They were found guilty and they were sentenced to death by hanging.
And does Jack Rackham see Anne Bonny before his execution?
According to Johnson, he asked as a special favor to be allowed one last touching farewell with his lover, the mother of his child, who's been sailing with, as pirates together with Anne Bonny. But Johnson says, all the comfort she gave him was to say that she was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog.
Not exactly the sort of tender farewell he was probably hoping for.
She was basically saying, tell it to someone who cares. So that was Calico Jack's goodbye, and he was hanged at Gallows Point. His body was hung up in an iron cage called a gibbet, which is where criminals' bodies were left to rot as a deterrent, the being made an example of, as we were talking about.
This is the government trying to say this is the fate of pirates. You really don't want to become a pirate.
You will end up hanged in an iron cage, exposed to the elements, your dead body exposed to the elements. In Rackham's case, he was hanged on a key that now bears his name, Rackham's Key, Jamaica. And yes, he was hanged there as a warning to the piratically minded. So if you've got a piratical bent of mind,
this is what will happen to you. Take a look at Captain Jack Rackham and think about whether you really want to be a pirate.
I mean, it's a folk song waiting to happen, isn't it? I can't believe Bob Dylan hasn't done, the ballad of Captain Jack.
I mean, the whole story of Calico Jack, of Anne and Mary, it feels like a Hollywood movie waiting to be made.
And I mean, if the producers hear it from us, you heard it here first. So now Anne Bonny and Mary Read were also tried, but they were tried separately.
Because they were women.
Presumably, the record doesn't say why, but they were tried separately later. So 12 days later, they were tried on 28th of November, 1720. They had no defense to offer, no witnesses to call. They basically say it's a fair cop. And so the judge issues the verdict. You, Mary Read, and Anne Bonny, are to go from hence to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution, where you shall be severally hanged by the neck, until you are severally dead, and God of his infinite mercy be merciful to both of your souls. It was then, and only then, that Mary Read and Anne Bonny dropped a joint bombshell. According to the record, the prisoners informed the court at this point, when they have been sentenced to execution by hanging, they informed the court that they were, and I quote, both quick with child, and prayed that execution of the sentence might be stayed.
So they're both pregnant.
They're both pregnant, and they want a reprieve on the basis of pregnancy.
And the law does allow for this. If women are pregnant, the child has committed no crime, no matter what the mother's done. And so the woman can't be hanged or can't be hanged immediately.
This is a practice known as pleading their bellies, requesting a stay of execution for the reasons that you say. So basically, the two women both say, I'm pregnant. The other one goes, I'm pregnant. And the court says that the sentence will be respited, so paused, while an inspection is made. So
to make sure that this isn't just a ruse.
Right. The court's not going to fall for it. Like, okay, you have to actually be pregnant. So this is the point. Again, so there's so many moments where this story is genuinely amazing. And this is one of them. Because exactly, you read that and you think, oh, well, it's a con, right? They're just going, oh, I'm pregnant. Don't hang me. But both women were examined and they were found to be telling the truth. They were both pregnant and both of them were reprieved.
Do we know what happens? I mean, they're still prisoners. They're still guilty of piracy.
The odds aren't good, are they? And in Mary Read's case, that is the end of the story. She was reprieved from execution, but she died in prison soon afterwards from what they then called jail fever, what we now know to be typhus. And that was before she gave birth. So her story and her unborn child is over. But Anne Bonny, her fate is uncertain. She was reprieved. She seems to have lived. She seems to have been released from prison, and nobody knows what happened to her. Some speculate, remember from the first episode, that she had a wealthy father back in Charleston.
Her father had been a lawyer and then become a plantation owner in Carolina.
And, he could still have been there. He might have secured her release, but there's no corroboration of this, so nobody is sure. Captain Johnson says in his history, "What has become of her since we cannot tell. Only this we know, that she was not executed." You will be amazed to hear that this story started to spread. It got around very quickly. And this is where some of the contemporary newspaper reports come in. They corroborate the factuality of this story.
This whole incredible story has now been heard in court. So it's going to spread. It's going to catch on.
Yeah. So anybody who was in Jamaica at the time is going to hear this story. So in Philadelphia, for example, in 1721, a captain called Samuel Lancelot, I love that name, he comes back having just left Jamaica and reports that he heard this story. He brings news that Captain Rackham, a pirate, and 10 of his men were executed for piracy and hung in chains. 2 women who were taken with him were condemned, but pleaded their bellies. So he, a few months later, corroborates the whole story.
So the story is spreading from British colony to British colony. All those colonies have got local newspapers. It is kind of spreading around the British Empire.
Right. And makes its way back to Britain very quickly, which presumably is where Captain Johnson hears it, and within a few years has incorporated it into his history of pirates. And that takes us back to our foundation. And this is where the legend starts to grow. I mean, we've been talking about how, we find this story fascinating. Imagine in 1724 what it sounded like, right? This is an incredibly provocative set of stories and cross-dressing women pirates. So it makes Johnson's history of pirates a huge success. And other editions follow quickly. They were, in fact, pardon the pun, pirated. That wasn't really pirating at the time, but sort of was.
And he puts them front and center of the book. He works out, Captain Johnson, that this history of the notorious pirates, that this story of these 2 women is going to really help him sell books.
He puts it front and center, literally and figuratively. It is on his title page. He says this book features the story of the notorious women pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Exactly. So the rumors are starting to go around. People have heard of them, but they don't really know the full story. He's got a hold of the trial record, and he's got a hold of what other accounts he's got. He's presumably embroidering it in some of the ways we've been talking about.
He may be talking to witnesses. He may be talking to sailors, people who are at the trial. We don't know, but he's gathering everything he can because he knows this story is really dynamite.
This is a good story. And the history of pirates includes illustrations of the women pirates. They're not going to miss the opportunity to give us pictures. Now, we need to bear in mind that these are artists who, of course, have never seen Anne Bonny or Mary Read. So these are not portraits. They are imagined depictions. They're projections of what it meant to be a female pirate. So, today we'd be picturing Keira Knightley in Pirates of the Caribbean or, whatever game people, might be playing. We'll have our images of what a female pirate looks like. But in what we'd learn from these pictures is not what Anne Bonny and Mary Read looked like, but what 18th century people thought that a woman pirate would look like. So what they show is how the legend is already forming. So these images are very easily found online for anybody who's interested. There are a couple different versions of them. There are these engravings that present them as quite large, quite masculine. They have this kind of exaggerated size. They've got ships behind them, which signals, their kind of theater of action. Mary Read stands to the left. She's holding a cutlass in one hand and an axe in the other. And then beside her, Anne Bonny is facing slightly away, gripping an axe. They both wear pistols strapped to their jackets. Their hair is shoulder length and loose. Their faces are not particularly feminine. They're kind of androgynous. And they are wearing, jackets and trousers in the way that the eyewitnesses stated that they did. That is from Johnson's original History of Pirates. The following year, there's a Dutch version, which has a much more provocative depiction. And in this one, we were talking earlier about whether Anne Bonny and Mary Read were likely to open up their shirts and expose their breasts while they were fighting. Well, as far as the 1725 Dutch printer is concerned, that is exactly what they did.
Well, the Dutch are far more liberal.
It's true. They're very comfortable with bodies, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So they have both women with long curly hair blowing in the wind, more feminized faces, shirts open to bare both breasts, and Anne Bonny has a pistol raised, which is the most historically accurate part of the illustration. Mary Read is basically drawn in the same way, sword raised, breasts exposed, with pistols and an axe at her waist.
So their story is being reimagined. It's spreading from the British Empire to the Netherlands and the Dutch Empire. This is a story that's really catching people's imagination.
It's really capitalizing on the titillating aspects of Johnson's own account, which his illustrations are more conservative. But in the Dutch version, they literalize. All of the breast flashing from Johnson's story makes its way into these pictures. I mean, if you've got a story that says that they're flashing their breasts, why would you have an illustration that doesn't show them flashing their breasts? As you were saying, there's an audience for that.
Then and now. The breast market is always going to be there, I suspect.
We're always going to be talking about the forgotten and overlooked aspects of history, but there are some continuities. And as you say, the breast market might be one of the continuities.
That's a stable.
Something we can count on in history. So that is the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. It's such an interesting story for so many reasons, but the most fundamental one is the ways in which it forces us to rethink our assumptions about the historical realities of piracy. Certainly speaking for myself, David, and you may look at it differently. But for me, I kind of always assumed that women pirates was a fantasy and that it was a Hollywood idea or a 19th century novelistic idea, not that there were actual women in 1720 who were dressing as men and engaging in battle on the high seas. And it's really fabulous to find out that there were.
Because so much of the pirate myth is exactly that. It's a myth. So many elements like the X on the map and the treasure chests were made up. It is easy to imagine that this is, a little extra detail added to a pirate story many years later. But as you say, these are real women, and there are real historical documents describing that not only were they there, but they were in some of the most ruthless pirates, certainly the most ruthless in Jack Rackham's somewhat dysfunctional crew.
Poor Jack Rackham, a hapless pirate. But it also encourages us to recognize another reality, which is that we think of pirates as just being these lawless men. But there were women, as we've said, but also there were free and enslaved black sailors. There were mixed race crews. It was a much more heterogeneous group than Hollywood usually depicts it as being. It wasn't democratic, really. It wasn't egalitarian, but it was much more fluid than the societies that they came from, and indeed than some of the societies that would later depict them.
I think that background reality is fundamental. This is a really repressive age. This is an age when government and authority and the law is really on your back. And if you're a woman, there's a whole other layer of repression of what you can and you can't do. It's difficult to imagine an arena in which Mary and Anne could be as free as they were, despite the terrible consequences, to be as free sexually, to be free in terms of their ability to gather material wealth than a pirate ship, which is not a great thing to say. And it's not advocating piracy or the violence of piracy, but there is no other place where they could be as libertine as they are, to use the 18th century phrase.
As you're saying, it's a way to access power and autonomy, right? And I think that is one of the reasons why it's still a kind of inspiring story, even if we don't want to romanticize the violence. We don't want to, we're not, as you say, endorsing outlaw and criminality, but the idea that in an era where power and autonomy was so restricted for so many, and particularly restricted for women, it's hard not to thrill to this idea of women grabbing what they could, what they wanted when they were able, and that they were able to do so much more, even for a brief period of time, than we might think.
And that distinction between those two words that you just used, outlaw and criminal, I think that underpins the strange relationship we have with piracy, because the violence of piracy is sometimes lost in the romance. I mean, piracy is seen, we have movies about piracy, there are video games about piracy. We send our kids to fancy dress parties dressed as little pirates. We wouldn't send them as little gangsters. So there's something strange about piracy, the way the legend has developed, that we kind of forget the violence. We don't really want to think about that. We want to think about the glamour of it. And that difference between outlaws, violence that somehow we find acceptable compared to criminals.
But it goes back to that point you were making about the repressiveness of the Hanoverian regime, doesn't it? Because when we find outlaws acceptable is when we see them as rebelling against a corrupt system or an oppressive system of where law and order becomes the bad guys, if you will, and the supposed moral hierarchy gets inverted. And you think of Robin Hood as the classic example of that, right, in our tradition. So the Sheriff of Nottingham, he's the sheriff, but he's the bad guy. He's absolutely the bad guy. And Robin Hood is the good guy outlaw who is forced into being an outlaw by an illegitimate, immoral regime. And the pirates fit very much into that moral logic, don't they?
Yeah, because this is an age when men are being press-ganged into the Navy, when life at sea is brutal, when life in the army is brutal, when there's failed harvests and people are going hungry. It's a really, really brutal time. And that Britain of the Georges, the Hanoverian kings, that is an authoritarian age in which the law and the legal codes are absolutely brutal. And to be somebody reading Johnson's book, living with all of that repression, the freedom of these people, even when you read about what happens to them in the end, even when you hear the stories of these terrible punishments, it's still a tantalizing vision of people living with freedoms that you will never have the nerve to try to seize for yourself.
But it's also, I think, the case that outlaws get that free pass of being outlaws rather than criminals in eras of extreme economic inequality because they are seen as being driven to desperate measures. So Bonnie and Clyde. But Bonnie and Clyde, okay, again, we're not going to romanticize what they did, but part of the reason why they got romanticized at the time was because during the Great Depression, they were seen as these poor people sticking it to the man, right? Highwaymen in the 18th century, same thing. They get romanticized, but it's because everybody is destitute. Everybody is desperate. And so you actually like the idea of a highwayman who, robs the fat cat aristocrat, right? Everybody likes that image. Bonnie and Clyde are robbing banks, right? Robin Hood steals from the rich and gives to the poor. So that part of the romanticization, the glamour of outlawry kind of has to be there for the legend to work. It isn't really part of the story of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, but they kind of benefit from association with it though, don't they?
But the very fact that we can talk about a golden age of piracy shows that piracy is exactly one of those outlaw activities that's given this free pass. I mean, we don't talk about the golden age of pickpocketing or the golden age of burglary.
Or fish stealing, indeed.
Yeah, but piracy, hopefully the more glamorous forms of piracy than some of the ones that Jack Rackham and his crew got up to, that does have this romance that's so firmly attached to it that we kind of want to forget the violence. We want to see it in this world of not crime, but of the outlaw, the folk hero almost. The folk hero,
exactly that. I think that's it for Anne Bonny and Mary Read. So thanks for joining us on the high seas with our gender-bending, fish-stealing female pirates.
Thank you very much.